The email went out at 11:14 on Tuesday morning, and by 11:22, the whole company had read it. Artistic director Soline Marchetti had used the word obsessed about me in writing, not the soft version. The word she chose was obsessed, and the sentence said that a certain core dancer had developed a pattern of attention toward the director that had become inappropriate and would be addressed through the standard channels. My name was not in the email. It did not need to be. Every dancer in the company knew the pattern she meant. I read the email twice, standing outside Studio 3 with rosin still on my hands, and did not move for a long moment. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. My name is Ines Halloran. I was 26 years old and had been with the Meridian Ballet Company for 4 seasons, and in those 4 seasons I had said perhaps 600 words directly to Soline Marchetti and catalogued approximately 8,000 things she had done in my peripheral vision. That was not obsession. That was the professional attention any core dancer gave to the woman who decided whether they ever moved out of the back row. Or at least that was what I had been telling myself for 4 seasons, standing in the wings and watching her from the shadows and pretending the watching was about the choreography. The email was signed with her full title, Soline Marchetti, Artistic Director. As if the title were the answer to any question I might have about what had just been done to me. I had been a Meridian dancer since the summer I turned 22. Before that, I had been a scholarship student at a regional school 2 states south, in a town nobody outside of the school had heard of, where my mother had waited tables at a diner across from the strip mall where the studio rented its second-floor space, and had folded her tips into an envelope in the kitchen drawer every Sunday for 6 years until she had enough to send me to the summer intensive that had produced the audition tape that had gotten me to Meridian. She was a woman who had not been asked her opinion by many people in her life and had developed the specific, quiet competence of people who had learned to make decisions correctly without ever being congratulated for them, and she had made the decision about the envelope without ever telling me she was making it, and I had understood only years later what had been in the drawer and why. She had never seen me dance in New York. She said the trip was too far, and she did not like the idea of watching me on a stage where she could not clap loud enough for me to hear her, which was, in the vocabulary my mother used for things she was afraid of, the most honest sentence she was willing to say. I sent her a program every season with my name circled in the core list, and she taped every program to the inside of the cabinet above the coffee maker, and my sister had confirmed, on one of the 2 visits she had made to the apartment in 6 years, that the cabinet door no longer closed properly because of the weight. I mentioned my mother because Soline had asked me, at the intake dinner in year 1, whether my family understood what I did. She had asked it the way she asked everything, evenly, without any editorial pressure attached to the question, and I had said yes because the true answer was too long for a dinner conversation, and she had looked at me for 1 second longer than the answer required and had moved on. I had assumed at the time that she had asked the question of every new dancer as part of the intake ritual. I had later learned, from a principal who was leaving to take a position with another company at the end of my first season, that she had not. She had asked it, that year, only of me. I finished my day. That was the first thing. I did not leave the building. I did not go to Soline's office and ask her what she thought she was doing. I walked into Studio 3 at 11:27 with rosin still on my hands and warmed up for the second act rehearsal I was scheduled for. And I danced the core sequence for the new production of the Winter Ballet, with the same precision I danced every core sequence, because I was the kind of dancer who understood that composure was the only currency that mattered in a building where every other currency was being watched by 20 people at once. Soline was not at the rehearsal. She never came to core rehearsals in the middle of a build. That was ballet mistress Vera Kirsanova's territory. Vera was 63 and had been a principal at the Kirov before she came to us, and she ran core rehearsals the way a metronome ran a piano lesson. Without commentary and without mercy. She watched me for 10 minutes and then said, "Halloran, take the phrase from the arabesque. Count of 5. I took the phrase from the arabesque on the count of 5. Vera watched, nodded once, and moved on to the next dancer, which was her way of saying she had seen what she needed to see and had decided not to make it my problem in front of everyone. I did not know then that Vera had already been in Soline's office that morning. I did not know for another 6 weeks. After rehearsal, I went to the dressing room and unpinned my hair and sat on the wooden bench in front of my locker with my hands in my lap and looked at the floor. The dressing room emptied slowly, the way it always did after core rehearsals, dancers filtering out toward the physical therapy room or the small kitchen where the espresso machine that Soline had bought us in her first year always had a line. I was the last one there. This was not unusual. I was often the last one there. This was one of the things I now understood had been catalogued. Marta Rai came back in. She was 34 years old and had been a principal for 6 years and was one of maybe 3 people in the company who had ever spoken to me like I was a person and not a core member. She sat down on the bench opposite mine without asking and set a small paper cup of espresso beside me on the wood. She said, "Drink that." I drank it. It was too hot. I burned my tongue and did not care. She said, "You are going to be fine," I said. She used the word obsessed. Marta said, "I read the email. I know what word she used." I looked up. Marta was watching me with the particular steadiness she brought to everything. The kind of steadiness that came from having been in this building longer than most of the current administration and having survived 2 artistic directors and a change in the board and 1 very ugly injury year. And she was one of the only dancers in the company who was not afraid of Soline Marchetti in any of the ways the rest of us were. She said, "Do you know why she did it?" I said, "Because I look at her too long." Marta said, "You do not look at her too long. You look at her exactly as long as any core dancer looks at the person who decides their casting. If you looked at her 1 second less, she would notice, and if you looked at her 1 second more, she would notice, and you have been threading that needle for 4 seasons, and I know because I have been watching you do it." I said, "Then why?" Marta said, "Because she looks back." I stared at her. The dressing room hummed. A pipe knocked somewhere behind the wall. My hands were folded very carefully in my lap, because if I unfolded them, I did not trust what they would do. Marta said, "I have watched Soline Marchetti run this company for 3 years. She does not look at dancers the way she looks at you. She corrects everyone. She notes everyone. She has favorites and she has projects and she has people she has decided she is developing. That is professional attention. What she does with you is different and I have been watching it, and half the company has been watching it. And the reason she sent that email this morning is because she has finally noticed that the whole building has been watching it too. And she is trying to reset the narrative in the only way she knows how." I said. "By making me the one who was watching?" Marta said. "By making you the one who was watching. Yes," I said. "That is the most cynical read I have ever heard." Marta said, "I have been in this building for 11 years. I do not have any other kind of read left." I laughed. It was not a real laugh. It came out short and surprised. Marta almost smiled. Almost. She stood up and took the empty espresso cup from my hand and dropped it in the small tin bin by the door. She said, "Do you know what you are going to do?" I said, "No." She said, "Do not do anything today. Do the class tomorrow. Do the rehearsal. Do the fitting for the winter costumes on Thursday. Show up in the building like nothing has happened for 1 full week and then decide." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because whatever she is doing because she is afraid. And a woman who is afraid of the thing she has already done is a woman who is going to do something else in the next 7 days. And I want you in a position to see what it is when she does it." She left. I sat on the bench for another 20 minutes before I got up and got my coat and walked out through the stage door into the cold gray afternoon. I lived in a small apartment on the 6th floor of a building south of the theater district. I made tea. I lay on the couch with my legs elevated on the arm because my hips were talking to me the way they always did after Vera's core rehearsals, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about the email. The email had said addressed through the standard channels. There were no standard channels for what she had implied. Soline had written those words into an email she knew perfectly well would trigger no actual channels, because the email itself was the channel. The email was the action. The email was what she had chosen to do about the fact that half the company had been watching her watch me. I thought about the corner of her mouth. Soline had a specific tell I had catalogued in year 1. She did not smile with her whole face. She smiled with the left corner, one small pull, and it happened only when something had genuinely surprised her. I had made that corner move 7 times in 4 seasons. I remembered all 7. The other thing I had catalogued was the space. Soline did not enter a room the way most people entered a room. She stopped just inside the door and took one full breath before she moved further in. And the breath was not for her. The breath was for the room. A moment of allowing the room to arrange itself around her presence before she required anything of it. I had watched her do it hundreds of times. There were other things. There was the way she wrote in the margins of the run sheets, always in graphite, never in ink, so that a note she made on Monday could be softened by Wednesday if the answer had changed. There was the way she carried a small paperback book in the inside pocket of every jacket she owned, and how the book was never the same book for more than 3 weeks, and how the corner of every book was folded to a specific page, which I had always suspected she was reading between meetings but had never confirmed. There was the way she took her coffee at 3 in the afternoon and only at 3 in the afternoon. Never earlier and never later, and how the assistant before Halcott had been let go, according to a rumor Marta had passed on to me my first summer. Because the woman had once brought the coffee at 2:45 and asked whether Soline would like it that way from then on. There was the way she watched company class from the far corner beside the piano, standing, not sitting, one hand at the bar for balance, in a way that was not about needing balance, but about giving her hand something to do, so that the rest of her could be entirely with the dancing. There was the way she never applauded at premieres. She would nod once, very small, at the end of a piece she thought had gone well, and the nod was worth more than an ovation from anyone else in the house. And every principal at Meridian could tell you the last time they had received one. I had never told anyone about the breath. I was aware that noticing the breath was the kind of noticing that would sound, if spoken out loud, exactly like the word she had used in the email that morning. Obsessed. I was not obsessed. I was a core dancer who paid the same detailed attention to the artistic director that I paid to every other element of my professional environment, because the attention was what kept me employed and moving toward the roles I wanted. Except perhaps in the way I looked at her, except perhaps in the way I always knew where she was in the building, except perhaps in the way I had memorized her breath at doorways. I went to bed and lay awake until 3. The next morning I came in at 7:30. Which was when the building was populated only by the janitorial staff and the pre-class accompanist and the artistic director, who had come in at that hour every morning for the entire 3 years of her tenure. This was one of the things I had catalogued. I did not go looking for her. I went to Studio 2 and did my own barre by the window that faced the alley. Soline did not use Studio 2 in the mornings. This too was catalogued. At 8:15 the door opened and Soline walked in. She did the breath. She stopped just inside the door and took the moment that let the room arrange itself around her, and then she looked across the studio at me at the barre and did not move any further. I did not stop the bar. I finished the phrase, because if I stopped, she would know her presence had stopped it, and if she knew, then everything in the email was true, and I was not willing to make the email true for her. I finished at the count of 8. I straightened. I turned to face her. She was wearing a black wool skirt to the calf and a dark gray sweater and low heels that made no sound on the studio floor. Her hair was down, which it almost never was at 8:15 at Meridian, and there was a small crease between her eyebrows I had catalogued as her expression when she was preparing to say something she had not fully rehearsed. She said, "Halloran?" I said, "Director." She said, "Do you have a moment?" I said, "I am in the middle of my barre." She said, "I can wait." She waited. She stood by the door and she waited, and I turned back to the bar and did the next phrase, which was Porte de Bras, and required me to keep my back to her for the count of 16. I kept my back to her for the count of 16. When I turned around again, she was still by the door. Her hands were folded in front of her. She looked, for 1 second, tired, in a way I had never seen. Soline Marchetti looked tired. She said, I said, "In private or in writing?" She said, "Whichever you want." I said, "I want both." The corner of her mouth moved. The left corner. One small pull, and she covered it by looking briefly at the studio window instead of at me, and then she looked back. She said, "Both." "Yes." I put my hand on the barre because I did not entirely trust my knees. I did not let her see me do it. I let her see the composed Cora dancer at the bar, in the 8:15 light, who had just been called obsessed in writing to her entire professional community, and had responded by finishing her port de bras. She said, "The email was a mistake. I want you to hear that from me before you hear the retraction from anyone else." I sent it in a state of professional panic, and I regret every word of it, and I have already spoken to legal counsel about the appropriate correction. There will be a second email later this morning. It will not have your name in it because your name was never in the first one, but it will make clear that the pattern I referenced does not exist and was never substantiated. I said, "You are retracting it." She said, "I am retracting it." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it was not true." I said, "All of it was not true. Or the part that named the pattern was not true." She looked at me. In the pale studio light, with her hair down and the crease between her eyebrows and the corner of her mouth twitching where she had almost smiled and covered it, she looked less like Soline Marchetti, the artistic director, and more like a woman who had spent the night the way I had spent the night, which was to say awake and staring at ceilings. She said, "I would like to have that conversation somewhere that is not the studio floor." I said, "When?" She said, "Whenever you can." I stared at her. Soline Marchetti did not move things. Soline Marchetti was a woman whose calendar was managed by an assistant named Halcott, who was the most feared assistant in the building because she guarded that calendar with the precision of a chess grandmaster defending the back rank. Soline Marchetti did not, in the history of my 4 seasons at Meridian, tell a dancer she had moved things. I said, "You moved things." She said, "I moved things." I said, "To have this conversation." She said, "Yes." I let the bar take a little more of my weight. The corner of her mouth had moved twice in 5 minutes. This was more than she had shown me in the entirety of the previous 4 seasons. I said, 6 o'clock. The small conference room off the atrium. She said, 6 o'clock. The small conference room. She turned and did the breath in reverse, which was a thing I had not known she also did, a moment of collecting the room's arrangement back into herself before she stepped out through the door. She left. The door clicked shut. I stood at the bar in the studio and did not move for a long minute. Because if I moved, I was going to sit down on the studio floor, and I did not want to sit down on the studio floor in a building where any of 8 cameras or 2 janitors or 1 accompanist could see me do it. I did the rest of my bar. I did it badly. I did it anyway. The second email arrived at 10:47. It went to the entire company. It said a previous communication had contained language that was speculative and unsupported, and that the artistic director wished to formally retract it. No dancer was under review. Distress caused was regretted. Signed Soline Marchetti, and CC'd to the executive director, the board chair, and the head of legal. Marta found me between morning class and the 11 o'clock rehearsal. I said. She came to Studio 2 at 8:15. Marta stopped walking. Soline Marchetti came to your morning bar. Alone. And you did not stop the bar. I said. No. Marta looked at me for one more second. You are going to be all right. Where is the meeting? I said. 6. The small conference room. Marta said. Wear the black turtleneck. Hair down, no earrings. She said the word obsessed and took it back in 12 hours, and you need her to know without saying it that she is going to earn back every one of those hours in front of you. I said. You have thought about this a lot. Marta said. I have been in this building for 11 years. I have thought about everything a lot. She walked away. I went to rehearsal and danced the Winter Ballet Corps sequence 3 times without a single missed count, because if you cannot control the woman who has just used the word obsessed about you in writing, you can at least control your feet. At 5:55 I was outside the small conference room off the atrium in the black turtleneck with my hair down and no earrings. The door was closed. The conference room had a frosted glass panel beside the door, and I could see the shape of her already inside, standing, not sitting, one hand on the back of a chair. She had come in early too. I knocked. She said, Come in. I came in and closed the door behind me. The conference room was small. A table for 6. 2 windows facing the atrium fountain. Soline was standing by the far window with the frosted glass at her back and the atrium light behind her, and she turned when I came in, and I could see the crease between her eyebrows again, and the way her hand was gripping the back of the chair with more pressure than any hand needs to grip a chair. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "You said you owe me an apology in private. I am here for the private one." She said, "Sit down, please." I sat. She sat across from me. She put both hands flat on the table in front of her, which was something I had watched her do in board meetings when she wanted the room to know that she was not going to gesture, and I understood in that moment that she was, in the way she knew how, trying not to reach for anything. She said, "I sent that email because I panicked." I said, "I know you sent it because you panicked. That is the only reading that makes sense. I want to know what you were panicking about." She was silent for a long moment. The conference room hummed the way small conference rooms hum when the ventilation runs against the atrium fountain outside. She looked at her hands. Then she looked up at me. She said, "The board chair asked me on Monday whether I had a conflict of interest with any dancer in the corps." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because Delphine Beaulieu on the executive committee received an anonymous note last week suggesting my casting decisions for the winter production reflected a personal partiality rather than a professional one." I said, "And your response to being asked that was to send an email calling me obsessed?" She said, "My response was to spend 26 hours attempting to construct a professional framing that would deflect the question, and on Tuesday morning at 11:12, I made the worst decision I have made in 3 years at this institution." I said, "Because it made me the target instead of you." She said, "Yes." I said, "Say the rest of it." She looked at me. In that 6 o'clock light, with the frosted glass at her back, and both her hands flat on the table where I could see them not moving, she looked like a woman who had walked into a room with a plan and discovered on arrival that the plan had never been survivable. She said, "The anonymous note was correct." I did not move. I did not let her see me not move. I sat exactly still with my hands folded in my lap the way I had sat on the dressing room bench that morning drinking Marta's espresso, and I looked at Soline Marchetti across a conference room table, and I said nothing at all. She said, "Not in the way it framed it. My casting decisions have been professional. I have been careful about that specifically because I have been aware for longer than I have been honest about of the risk. But the reason I have been aware of the risk is the reason the note existed in the first place, which is that the pattern the anonymous note observed is a real pattern, and it is a pattern that runs the opposite direction from the one my email described this morning." I said, "You are telling me that the pattern is you." She said, "I am telling you that the pattern is me." "Yes." I said, "For how long?" She said, "Since the spring gala in your second season, when you danced the second variation in the foray. You made a choice on the count of 32 that was not the choreography, and I noticed it and I was going to speak to you about it, and instead I stood in the wings for the rest of the piece and did not speak to you about it and have not spoken to you about it since. And I have not spoken to you about a great many other things across the 2 seasons that followed. And this morning I sat at my desk with a note from the board chair on top of my inbox, and I chose to protect the version of myself that has spent 2 years not speaking to you by making the not speaking your problem instead of mine." I said, "That is the most complete sentence anyone has ever said to me." She said, "I owe you at least that." I said, "You owe me considerably more than that. Say the next part." She said, "I do not know what the next part is." I said, "Yes, you do." She looked at me for a long second. The corner of her mouth moved, not toward a smile this time, toward something else, something that was not composed, and not covered, and not turned away from. She said, "I rearranged my Wednesday." I said, "What?" She said, "I rearranged my Wednesday. I moved the board finance subcommittee to Thursday morning. I moved the costume shop walkthrough to Friday. I moved the donor lunch to next week. I cleared the afternoon from 1 o'clock through 6, and I have not told Halcott why, and Halcott has not asked, which she never does not ask, which means she has already inferred. I did all of this before I came to Studio 2 this morning, because I knew before I sent the email that I was going to have this conversation with you, and I did not want the calendar to be the reason I did not have it. I said, "You moved a donor lunch." She said, "For a conversation with you." The distinction landed in the room and stayed there. Soline Marchetti did not distinguish between dancers and their positions when she spoke about them in professional contexts. She spoke about roles and castes and levels. She had just corrected a core dancer into you, and she had done it without flinching, because the sentence about the calendar required the correction to be true, and she was not willing to make the sentence less true to make it easier to say. I said, "Wednesday." She said, "Wednesday." I said, "You called this a conversation and you moved 5 hours for it." She said, "I did not know how long the conversation would take. I did not want to be the one who cut it short." I put my hand on the edge of the table because I did not entirely trust my hand in my lap anymore. Soline watched my hand move. She did not comment on my hand moving. She kept her own hands flat where they were and she waited, and the waiting was the most careful thing I had ever watched her do. I said, "I need to say something and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." She said, "Yes." I said, "You used the word obsessed about me in writing this morning to your entire professional community. And the fact that you have now told me you have been the one paying attention for 2 years does not undo the fact that between 11:14 and 10:47 this morning, 43 people I work with read a sentence that made me the person who was watching too closely, and some of them will remember the first email longer than they will remember the retraction, and some of them will remember both and will draw their own conclusions about why the retraction came, and I am going to spend the next 2 years dancing core sequences in front of people who read that first email and made a decision about me, and no calendar you have rearranged will pull those 43 sets of eyes off my back. Do you understand what you did?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Then say it in a sentence." She said, "I put the cost of my not speaking onto you, and I did it in writing, and I did it publicly, and there is no version of this in which you have not paid a price that I am the one who should have paid, and I am aware that this apology is not sufficient, and I have not asked you to accept it as sufficient. I am asking you to know that I know." I said, "I know that you know." She said, "Thank you." I said, "That is not the same as accepting the apology." She said, "I did not think it was." We sat there. The fountain ran. Somewhere in the atrium, a group of dancers passed through toward the stage door, their voices small through the frosted glass, laughing about something I could not make out. Soline did not turn toward the sound. She kept her eyes on mine. Her hair was down. The crease was still between her eyebrows. I had catalogued her hair being down at meridian exactly twice in 3 years, and both times it had been late at night after a full run of a premiere. This was 6:09 in the evening on a Tuesday, and her hair was down and she was sitting across a conference room table from a core dancer she had just apologized to about a sentence she had written 7 hours ago. And the hair being down was, in the vocabulary of Soline Marchetti, a form of undressing I had not yet decided how to look at directly. I said, "What do you want from Wednesday?" She said, "I want to sit in a room with you where neither of us has a professional obligation to be anywhere else. I want to answer whatever questions you have not yet asked me. I want to hear whatever you are willing to tell me about the 2 years you have spent on the other side of this. And when the 5 hours are over, I want us to leave the room, having said out loud the things that have been in this building between us for longer than either of us has admitted, and I want you to know, before you agree to any of it, that whatever you decide to do about it afterward is entirely yours to decide." I said, "Where?" She said, "Not in the building. There is a small tea room on Aldercroft Street 6 blocks from here. I have been there twice. The back room has a door." I said, "Aldercroft Street." She said, 1 o'clock. If you come, I will be there. If you do not come, I will be there anyway until 6, and I will not send a message and I will not follow up. And on Thursday morning, I will be in my office at 7:30, as I always am, and the answer will be whatever your absence means, and I will not require you to explain it." I said, "You have thought about this." She said, "I have thought about very little else since 11:12 this morning." I stood up. She did not stand up. She stayed where she was, with her hands flat on the table and her hair down, and the crease between her eyebrows and the corner of her mouth doing the small pull it did when she had almost let the composed version go. I said, "I have not decided about Wednesday." She said, "I would not want you to have decided." I said, "I will let you know by leaving my building or not leaving it." She said, "Understood." I walked to the door of the conference room. I put my hand on the handle. I did not turn it yet. I looked back at her across the room. She was still seated. She had not moved. In the atrium light through the frosted glass she looked, for one clean second, less like Soline Marchetti, and more like the woman who had stood inside a studio doorway at 8:15 in the morning and taken a breath before entering a room where the only other person was a core dancer she had spent 2 years not speaking to. I said, "Soline?" Her chin lifted 1 degree. It was the first time I had used her name in 3 years. She had told me at the intake dinner in my first season to use her name in private, and I had never done it, and she had not asked again. The way she moved her chin now told me she had catalogued the omission as completely as I had catalogued everything else. I said, "The email cost me something today. Wednesday will cost me something too. I need you to understand that I am not walking to Aldercroft Street to make it easy for you." She said, "I have not asked you to make it easy." I said, "I am walking, if I walk, because I have been paying attention for 4 seasons, and I would like, once, to be paid attention to in return, and I would like, once, to hear you say a sentence in which the word you use for what has been happening between us is not obsessed." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a pull toward a smile. A small tightening that meant something in her throat had just closed and she was managing it. She said, "I will use whatever word you tell me to use." I said, "That is not the same as choosing the word yourself." She said, "No, it is not." I said, "Then choose it, on Wednesday, if I come." She said, "Yes." I opened the door. I stepped through. I closed it behind me. In the atrium the fountain was running and 2 of the wardrobe assistants were carrying a bolt of pale silk toward the elevator, and the light from the tall windows was going, the specific gray it went at 6:15 in the evening, in this city in the fall. And I walked past all of it, and out the stage door, and down the steps, and onto the pavement, without letting my knees know that anything at all had happened in the last hour. I got to the corner of the block before I stopped walking. I put my hand on the brick wall of the coffee shop and breathed through my nose for a count of 8, and I stood there in the gray evening and thought about the meeting she had put on the calendar for tomorrow. Soline Marchetti had cleared 5 hours of her calendar for a conversation with a core dancer she had, that same morning, publicly implied was obsessed with her. She had done the clearing before she sent the email. She had done it knowing what the email would cost me, and what a 5-hour conversation in the back room of a tea shop would cost both of us if anyone saw us walk in, and she had done all of the moving before any of the cost had actually landed. Which meant, she had already decided, somewhere in the 26 hours between the board chair's note and the email, that whatever version of herself walked out of that tea shop on Wednesday evening was going to be a different woman than the one who had walked in. And she had done it without asking me first. I thought about the sentence she had said about the spring gala, and the count of 32 in the Fare variation. She had remembered the count, which meant that somewhere in the 2 years since, she had either written it down or repeated it to herself often enough that it had become memorized. The way I had memorized her breath at doorways. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, a message from a number I did not have saved. It said only, 1 o'clock, Aldercroft. The green door, no signature, it did not need one. I did not respond. I walked the 6 blocks to my building and climbed the 6 flights of stairs and unlocked my door, and I stood in my dark apartment for a long time, with my coat still on and my keys still in my hand, thinking about the green door. I did not know yet whether I was going to walk through it. I stood in the dark for a long time. I did not turn on the lamp. I hung my coat and set my keys in the small blue dish where I always set them, and I walked to the window and let the whole day sit in my chest, the way you let a bruise sit before you decide whether it is bone or only skin. I did not sleep well. I got up at 6 and made tea, and stood at the window with the cup in both hands, and I thought about the fact that Soline had told me she would be there, whether I came or not, and would ask me for nothing if I did not. That was the sentence I could not walk past. She was not asking me for a decision. She was making one of her own and telling me the shape of it, and letting me choose whether to enter that shape or not. At 12:10, I put on the black wool coat and the plain scarf and walked out of my building and turned left toward Aldercroft Street. I did not walk fast. I walked at the pace of a woman going nowhere in particular in the middle of a Wednesday. I turned onto Aldercroft and found the green door a third of the way down the block, unmarked except for a small brass plate that said only Callan and Sons, Tea, and below the name a smaller line that said Members and Guests. I put my hand on the handle. I looked at my hand for 1 second, then I opened the door. The front room was dim and quiet. A woman at a small polished counter looked up and said, "The back room. Through the corridor. She is expecting you." I walked through. The corridor smelled of bergamot and lapsang and the clean starch of a place that had been serving tea to the same clientele for 80 years. At the end was another door, heavier. It swung inward on quiet hinges. The back room was small. One round table by a leaded window that looked onto a courtyard where a fountain in the shape of a fish was running clear water into a stone bowl. 2 chairs. A low fire in a black iron grate. A tea service already brought in. A small plate of thin brown biscuits and a jug of milk. And Soline, sitting in the chair facing the door, in dark slacks and a cream wool sweater and no jewelry, with her hair down and a book closed beside her cup, and the crease still between her eyebrows. She looked up when I came in. She did not stand. She said only, "You came." I said, "You said you would be here whether I did or not." She said, "Yes." I said, "That was the thing that made me come." She looked at me for a long second. The corner of her mouth moved, not a smile, something quieter than a smile. Something that looked, in the leaded window light, like relief that she was not going to let herself show any more of. She said, "Sit down, please." I took off the coat. I hung it on the back of the empty chair. I sat. She poured the tea. Her hands were steady. I watched them because I had spent 4 seasons watching them mark corrections into the corners of run sheets and pin cast lists to the studio corkboard with a single pin pushed straight in with the pad of her thumb. And now they were pouring tea into a cup for me in a back room off Aldercroft Street on a Wednesday afternoon. And the strangeness of that was not something I was going to get used to inside one afternoon. She said, "I owe you the sentence I did not have last night. I have had it since about 4 in the morning. I would like to say it now, because I do not entirely trust that I will still be able to say it if we spend an hour on smaller things first." I said, "Say it." She said, "I love you." I put the cup down on the saucer very carefully. The saucer made a small clean sound against the wood. She said, "I have loved you for 2 years, and I did not have a word for it that I was willing to use, and I let that unwillingness cost you something yesterday, and I am telling you the word today, because you were owed the word before you were owed anything else." That is the sentence. I said, "You promised me you would choose the word yourself." She said, "I did choose it." I said, "You chose the largest one available." She said, "I chose the accurate one. Any smaller word would have been another version of not saying it." I sat there. The fountain ran in the courtyard. The fire in the black grate made the small ticking sound that low fires make when they are settling into their bed of ash. I picked up the cup again and held it in both hands because my hands wanted something to hold, and I did not trust them with the table edge again. I said, "All right." She said, "All right." I said, "That is not an answer. I am saying I heard you. I am not saying yet what I am going to do with what I heard." She said, "I know." I said, "I need you to tell me what happens on Thursday." She said, "On Thursday I go into the office at 7:30, and I go directly to the executive director, and I disclose in writing that I have developed a personal conflict with a member of the Corps, and that I have not managed it well, and I am formally requesting a review of every casting decision I have made, involving that dancer for the past 2 years. I have already drafted the letter. It is in my bag. I brought it in case you asked me to prove I would send it." I said, "Show me." She reached into her bag and slid 2 pages across the table. Meridian letterhead, addressed to the executive director, and CC'd to the board chair and the head of legal. They named me by full name in the second paragraph. They asked for an outside reviewer. They offered her resignation if the review found any casting decision that could not be defended on artistic grounds independent of her personal state. I said, "You would resign?" She said, "If the review shows I have chosen you for a role you did not earn on your own merits, I would have no other honest option." I said, "You know I earned every role I have had at Meridian." She said, "I know. That is why I am able to file the letter without fear about the outcome. But the review must happen regardless. If I am the one asking for it rather than being subjected to it, the outcome carries more weight and costs you less." I said, "It still costs me." She said, "Yes. Your name will be circulated to 3 people, and one of those people is Vera, and one is Halcott. It is not zero cost. I am not pretending it is. What you get from me from Thursday forward is that I will not be in a position to influence your career at Meridian in any direction, and it does not include any expectation about what you owe me in return. If you want to walk out of this room today and never speak to me privately again, and only see me at company events where we are seated across a room and forced by circumstance to be professional, that is the arrangement I will accept, and I will not ever ask you for more of it than that." I said, "You have planned all of this." She said, "I planned it between 4 and 6 this morning. I did not sleep either." I said, "You planned it after I left the conference room." She said, "I planned it because I left the conference room understanding that the version of me you deserved to hear from was the version that had already done the disclosure, not the version that was promising to do it if you asked." I looked at the letter on the table between us. Her signature was already on the second page, in the very deliberate hand she used for institutional signatures, with the date left blank. She had signed it before she knew whether I would come. I said, "You signed it before I walked in." She said, "I signed it at 5:45 this morning. If you had not come, I would have gone to the office at 7:30 and filed it. Nothing about the letter was contingent on you." I put the letter down. I put both my hands flat on the table, mirroring the way she had put her hands flat on the conference room table the night before, and I looked across the small round tea table at Soline Marchetti in the leaded window light, and I understood something I had not understood the night before. She had done all of the difficult work before the conversation with me had ever begun. She had not been asking me on Tuesday evening what she should do. She had been telling me what she was already going to do, in a language quiet enough that I would not feel obligated by it. She had made the decision that would cost her most, and she had made it privately, and she had signed the paper before she knew whether I would open the green door, because whether I opened the green door had nothing to do with whether the paper needed to be signed. I said, "That is the most complete thing anyone has ever done for me." She said, "It was not for you. It was because it was correct." I said, "Soline." She said, "Yes." I said, "You are allowed to say that both things are true." She looked at me. The corner of her mouth moved, and this time it did not stop at the small pull. It went a little further. It went into something that was almost a smile, and then it did not cover itself. She let me see it. She sat in the chair with the crease between her eyebrows and the corner of her mouth, doing something she was not going to look away from, and she said, "All right, both things are true. It was because it was correct, and it was for you." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome." We drank the tea. She had known which one I would like without asking. It was a smoky lapsang that she poured with a splash of milk, which I had never told anyone at Meridian I took my tea with, which meant she had watched me at one of the after-performance receptions 3 seasons ago add milk to a cup of lapsang at the drinks table and had remembered. I said, "You watched me at the fall reception in year 1. She said, "I watched you at the fall reception in year 1. I said, "You should never tell anyone the specific things you have watched me do. It sounds worse than it is." She said, "I have not told anyone. I have not intended to tell you. I would prefer to keep having watched you as a matter between me and my own accounting." I said, "That is a very dangerous sentence." She said, "I know." I said, "Say another one." She looked at me across the table. She said, I did not touch the milk jug just now until after you sat down, because I did not want to presume that you still took it that way. I said it out because I did not want you to have to ask. I said, you are terrible at not presuming. She said, I have been terrible at not presuming for 2 years. I have been getting worse. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had done in 26 hours. It surprised me, and it surprised her, and she covered a small answering thing with her cup that was not quite a laugh but was the first cousin of one, and the small round tea table with the low fire and the fountain in the courtyard, and the two of us on either side of it felt, for one clean second, like a room I had walked into by accident and might not want to walk back out of. We stayed there for 3 hours. We did not use all 5. We talked about the spring gala in my second season and the count of 32 in the 4 variation, and I told her the choreographer had written a step that was inaccurate to the music and I had corrected it by half a second, and she told me she had known that was what I was doing and that was the moment she had understood I was going to be a soloist someday whether Meridian gave me the roles or not. We did not talk about the roles I had not been given. She did not offer explanations for casting decisions because she did not want any explanation to sound like it was influencing my decision about her, and I did not ask for them. We talked about smaller things instead. She asked me how my hips had held up through the winter build. I told her the left one was better than the right, and that Vera had noticed both before I had said anything, which Soline received without surprise, because Vera noticed everything, and was fond of me in the specific way. Ballet mistresses who had once been principals were fond of dancers they suspected of being smarter than they were letting on. She told me she had been reading a biography of a choreographer she had disliked all her professional life, because she had decided at 40 that it was more useful to read the biographies of the people who irritated her than the ones she admired. And the discipline of finishing a book about a woman she did not like was the closest thing she had to a private practice. I told her I read the same 3 novels every winter and had read them so many times that the specific weight of the paperbacks in my hand was more familiar than the plots. She asked me which 3. I told her. She wrote them down on the back of a receipt from the tea counter, without asking whether I would prefer she not write them down, and put the receipt in the inside pocket of her jacket. And that was the moment I understood that the small paperback book she carried in every jacket was going to be, for the rest of her reading life, a book she had chosen, at least partly because I had once mentioned it in a back room off Aldercroft Street on a Wednesday afternoon in the fall. She asked me about my mother, not in the intake dinner way, in the way that meant she had remembered the question she had asked 4 years ago and had been carrying it since. I told her about the envelope in the drawer. I told her about the programs in the cabinet. I told her, because she had earned it by having remembered, and by not making a face when I said the word waitress, that my mother had never seen me dance on this stage, and had not, so far as I could tell, ever intended to. Soline took a long breath and let it out, and did not offer to fly my mother to New York, because she understood that offering to fly my mother to New York would have been the kind of gesture that was for the person offering and not the person receiving, and instead, she said only, she should not have to see you on a stage where she cannot clap loud enough. That is a good sentence. I would like to keep it. And I let her keep it. Because she had asked to keep it, and because it was true. At 4:15 she looked at the clock over the fireplace. She said, I have said what I came to say. If you want to leave now, I will not be offended. If you want to stay, we can order more tea. I said, I want to walk, not here. Somewhere with air. She said, all right. She paid at the counter. The woman my age at the polished counter did not comment on the fact that Soline had paid for 2. We stepped out onto Aldercroft in the 4:20 light. It was cold. The sky was the color of paper again, but a warmer paper than the morning. We walked. She did not offer her arm, and I did not take it. We walked 6 blocks north to the park at the edge of the theater district, and we did 1 loop around the fountain that was not running because it had already been drained for winter, and neither of us said anything for the length of the loop. When we got back to the entrance, she stopped. I stopped. She said, I am going to file the letter first thing tomorrow. I said, I know. She said, after I file it, I do not know what the review timeline looks like exactly. I want you to know I will not contact you during the review except through professional channels, and I will only contact you through professional channels if there is something you specifically need to know as a matter of your employment. I will not use the review as a reason to see you, and I will not use the review as a reason to avoid you either. I will be in the building. I will speak to you when we pass each other in a corridor the way I speak to any dancer. I will not look at you longer than I look at anyone else. That is going to be very hard for me, and I am telling you that not so you will feel sorry for me, but so you will know that I know it is going to be hard, and I am doing it anyway. I said, "When the review ends," she said. "When the review ends, if you want to have another conversation, you will tell me. If you do not tell me, I will not tell you. That is the arrangement." I said, "All right." She said, "All right." I said, "Soline, one more thing." She said, "Yes." I said, "The word you chose in the tea room, I do not have a word to give you back yet. I want you to know that not having a word back is not the same as not having anything. It is that I have been paying attention for 4 seasons, and I have not spent any of those 4 seasons letting myself have a word for it either, and I am not going to give you a word today that I cobble together in a park in 20 minutes. When I have the word, if I have it, you will hear it." She said, "That is more than I asked for." I said, "You did not ask for anything, that is why I am giving you this much." The corner of her mouth moved. She looked at the drained fountain. She looked back at me. She said, "Go home, Inez." It was the first time she had ever said my first name. My first name in her mouth was a small, quiet event that I did not entirely know what to do with. I nodded. I turned. I walked out of the park in the direction of my building, and I did not look back, because if I looked back I was going to walk back to her, and walking back to her was not what either of us had just agreed on. She filed the letter on Thursday at 7:40. I know because Halcott sent a note to the Corps at 10:03 that morning stating that Vera Kirsanova would be sitting in on all Corps rehearsals for the winter production, and that any questions about casting for that production should be directed to her. Halcott did not say why. She did not need to. By 11 the whole company had inferred. Marta found me in the dressing room at 11:15. She said, "She filed. She named you." I said, "She said keeping my name out would have looked like a cover." Marta said, "She is not wrong. Half the company is going to spend the next 6 weeks trying to work out whether the review is real or whether it is theater, and the way they will decide is by watching how you two behave in this building." "Do you love her?" I said, "I do not know yet." Marta said, "Do you know that you do not know?" I said, "Yes." Marta said, "All right. Then behave like a dancer whose casting is being reviewed by an outside party. Do not go looking for her. Do not pass her office without a reason. If at the end of 6 weeks you still do not know, then the review has given you the gift of 6 weeks in which you did not have to look at her, and you can decide what you want out of what that 6 weeks felt like." I said, "You are being kind to me." Marta said, "I am being professional to you. If I were being kind, I would tell you to go stand outside her office right now and not leave until she looked at you. Do not test me on it." The review ran 7 weeks. The outside reviewer was a woman named Gien Halloran who was, coincidentally, no relation, though the first time her name appeared in an all-company memo, I saw 2 dancers exchange a look across the studio, and I understood I was going to be answering that question for the rest of my career. She was a former principal from a company in the West, and she was known for reviews of exactly this kind, which she conducted with the specific quiet efficiency of a woman who had seen versions of the same situation across 3 continents and had opinions about none of them. She interviewed me in the 3rd week. 40 minutes in a small room off the administrative wing, no recording, hand notes. She asked me about every role I had been given and every role I had auditioned for and not been given. She asked whether I had ever felt Soline had cast me above my level or below it, or applied professional pressure of any kind. She did not ask what I thought about Soline. She asked only about what Soline had done, and she made the distinction clear in the way she framed each question. I answered accordingly. At the end she said, "One last question. Do you believe the casting decisions have been artistically justified, independent of her personal state?" I said, Yes, without qualification. She wrote it down. She looked up. She said, I will tell you one thing off the record because I think you have earned it. Directors who file the letter voluntarily, without being pressed to, are always the ones I clear. The letter is the thing that indicates the judgment is intact. If the judgment were not intact, the letter would never have been written. I sat with that. She was not supposed to tell me. I did not ask why she had. I said only, thank you, and stood, and left. I did not see Soline during the review except at 3 company-wide events and 1 open rehearsal. At each of them, she behaved exactly as she had told me she would. She looked at me the way she looked at every dancer. She did not linger. She did not avoid me. In the corridor after the open rehearsal, she passed me and said, Halloran, well done today. In the same tone she used with the 4 other dancers she said it to that morning, and she did not slow her step and I did not slow mine, and we crossed each other clean and kept walking. The 7 weeks did a specific thing to the inside of my chest that I did not have language for at the time, and only later understood was the shape of what she had been holding for 2 years. Every morning I woke at 5:45 without an alarm. Every morning I made coffee and stood at the window and let the not seeing her sit in me for 1 measured minute before I got dressed. And every morning, the not seeing was slightly more present than it had been the morning before. It was not longing. That word belongs to a thing you have never had. This was something else. It was the daily accounting of a thing I now knew was mine to accept or decline, held in abeyance, while the accepting or declining was in the hands of a stranger from a company 2,000 miles away, and the accounting became, by the 4th week, the most honest form of prayer I had ever practiced. Marta noticed. Of course she noticed. She stopped commenting on it after the 2nd week, which was her way of telling me that she trusted me to keep myself together without her active supervision, and I took the not commenting as the specific kindness it was. We had lunch together on Wednesdays because we always had lunch together on Wednesdays, and we did not talk about Soline, and the not talking was another form of professional discretion Marta had learned in 11 years at Meridian and had chosen to extend to me now. Once, in the 5th week, she asked me how I was sleeping. I said, better than I would have expected. She said, you are going to tell her yes. I said, I know. She said, you should know I already knew. I said, you know everything. She said, I know most things. The open rehearsal was in the 6th week. I had been assigned to demonstrate a core sequence for the visiting patrons who paid the price of admission by donating a specific number to the fundraising office each year, and the sequence required me to stand at the front of the stage for approximately 11 seconds, with my back to the house, while the other 4 dancers entered from the wings. During those 11 seconds I could see, in the mirror on the back wall of the studio, the exact row of chairs where Soline was seated. She was in the 4th chair from the aisle, in a black wool jacket, hands folded in her lap. She was watching the choreography, not me, in the way she had told me she would. But at second 7, when the other 4 dancers had entered, and the sequence turned toward the mirror, and I had to move my head 1 degree to the left to prepare the turn, her eyes met mine in the mirror for exactly 1 second. And she did not look away, and I did not look away. And then she looked back at the choreography, and I finished the turn on the count, and nobody in the house had noticed, and both of us had noticed, and the noticing was the entire content of the 6th week for me, and I imagined for her. It was the hardest thing I have ever watched her do. It was harder to watch than the letter had been to read. She had spent 2 years cataloging me in ways I now knew about, and she was not letting a single one of them show, and the discipline it took to keep them hidden was, in its own way, the most eloquent thing she had ever said to me about the shape of what she felt. Gin Halloran filed her report at the end of the 7th week. It cleared Soline of any professional misconduct in casting. It recommended that Soline retain her position with the modification she had already proposed, which was formal withdrawal from casting authority over any dancer with whom she had disclosed a conflict. It stated in a paragraph near the end that the core dancer named in the review had shown, in the reviewer's assessment, exemplary professional judgment throughout the process, and had at no point been observed to accept or expect any advantage from the situation. The paragraph did not say my full name. It did not need to. The board accepted the recommendations. Halcott sent the memo. The company was informed at a Monday morning meeting. Soline addressed us briefly. She said only that the review had cleared her, that she had accepted the modification, and that she was grateful for the professional discretion of the core and principals during the process. She did not look at me during any of it. This was correct. This was what we had agreed on. I went home that night. I made tea. I sat on the couch, and I thought about the 7 weeks and the corridor crossings and the letter and the tea room and the sentence about not having a word to give her back. And I understood that I did have one now. It had come, the way she had said her own sentence had come, at some point between 4 and 6 in the morning across a period of weeks, without ceremony, and I had known it for at least a fortnight, and had been waiting for the review to end before I acknowledged to myself that I had known it. I did not send her a message. That was not the arrangement. The arrangement was that if I wanted to have another conversation, I would tell her, and telling her was not something you did over a text message from a couch at 9 at night. I waited 3 days, not to test her, to be sure I meant it. On Thursday morning at 7:25, I walked into the building. Halcott was at her desk in the outer office of the 4th floor. She looked up when I came in. Halcott had known everything for approximately 2 months longer than anyone else in the building had known anything, and she had not, in that time, allowed a single one of the things she knew to show on her face. She looked at me now, with the same neutral cataloging attention she brought to every person who ever walked into her outer office. I said, "Is she in?" Halcott said, "She is at her desk." I said, "Does she have 5 minutes?" Halcott said, "She has whatever amount of time you need. Please go in." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome, Halloran." She waited a beat. Then she said, in the driest voice I had ever heard from her, "I have been holding the 7:45 for a week in case you came." I said, "Halcott." She said, "Go in." I opened the door of Soline's office. Soline was at her desk. She looked up. She did not stand. She did not do the corner of her mouth. She did nothing with her face at all except register that I was there, which was, from her, the most controlled possible response to the person she had loved for 2 years walking into her office at 7:26 on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the review had cleared her. I closed the door behind me. I said, "I have the word." She put the pen down. She did not ask which word. She waited. I said, "The word is yes." She looked at me. The crease between her eyebrows deepened for 1 second and then went. The corner of her mouth moved. She said, "Yes, to which?" I said, "Yes to all of it. Yes to the sentence you said in the tea room. Yes to a conversation. Yes to a dinner. Yes to whatever version of this we can build that does not require you to hide anything at work, and does not require me to pretend I do not know what I know. Yes, to walking into your office at 7:26 on a Thursday morning and telling you that." "Yes." She said, "Come here." I came around the desk. I stopped a foot from her chair. She looked up at me from the chair. She did not stand yet. She lifted one hand. She put it, palm open, against my jaw. Warm, present. She held my jaw for 1 long second and did not move her hand, and she looked at my face the way she had looked at me across studio floors for 2 years, and she did not do the covering thing this time. She said, "I am going to stand up now." I said, "Yes." She stood. She was almost my height. She kept her hand where it was. She put the other one lightly at my waist. She did not pull me. She held both hands where they were, and she looked at me and she said, "You do not have to." I said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know that." I said, "I know." I put my hand on the back of her neck under her hair. Her hair was down. It was down at 8 in the morning in her office, which meant she had come in with it down. Which meant she had come in with it down every day for 7 weeks. I had not let myself notice. I let myself notice now. I kissed her. It was patient. It was earned. It was the sum of 2 years of not doing this, and it took its time. She did not rush. Her hand moved slowly from my jaw into my hair and stayed there, and she made a small sound at the back of her throat that was the sound of a woman who had been holding a great deal, very still, for a very long time, and was allowing the stillness to shift by exactly 1 degree, and I held her carefully because I understood, from the sound, that she was letting me see something she had never let anyone see before, and I did not want to be careless with the seeing. We stopped. We did not stop because we wanted to. We stopped because Halcott had a phone that occasionally rang, and it rang, and both of us laughed, and Soline put her forehead against mine for 1 second, and then stepped back, and I stepped back, and we stood a foot apart in her office at 7:29 on a Thursday morning, with the phone ringing in the outer office, and Halcott almost certainly answering it, and almost certainly telling whoever was calling that Miss Marchetti was in a meeting that would run somewhat longer than 7:45. Soline said, "Dinner." I said, "When?" She said, "Tonight." I said, "Where?" She said, "My apartment, if that is not too much." I said, "It is not too much." She said, 8. I said, 8. She said, "Ines." I said, "Yes." She said, "I would like you to walk out of this office now, because if you do not walk out now, I am not going to be able to send the 2 emails I need to send before 9. I said, "Understood." I walked out. Halcott looked up from her phone. She did not comment on anything. She said only, "Have a good rehearsal, Halloran." I said, "Thank you, Halcott." I went to class. I did not miss a count. I did not miss a count in any of the classes or rehearsals for the rest of that week, or the week after, or the 6 months that followed. I went to dinner at her apartment that night. 5th floor, 4 blocks from the theater district. She had cooked something simple. 1 candle on the table, 1 bottle of wine, a small speaker, playing something with a piano, and no words. We ate. We talked. When it was late, she asked me to stay, and I stayed, and the staying was the specific soft thing that private hours were for. In the morning she made me tea with milk in it, and did not comment on the milk, and I did not comment on her not commenting, and we drank the tea on her small couch by the window that faced east, and neither of us said anything for a long time. We did not need to. In the 3rd month, at the winter benefit gala, we walked in together. She did not put her hand at my back. She did not need to. Every person in the room understood by the time we had crossed the first 10 feet that we had walked in together on purpose. Marta, from across the room, raised her glass by exactly 1 inch in what looked, to anyone who did not know her, like an idle motion. We crossed to where the board chair was standing. Soline introduced me by my full name and did not adjust her voice for the introduction. The board chair, whose name was Ada Fenwick, looked at me for 1 second longer than the introduction required and said, "Miss Halloran, I have been hoping to meet you." I said, "It is a pleasure." Ada Fenwick smiled the small, controlled smile of a woman who had been running boards for 30 years and had understood by the second sentence that everything was going to be all right. Later, at the drinks table, Marta stopped beside me. She did not look at Soline, who was 3 yards away in conversation with the head of a foundation that funded the education program. She said, quietly, into her glass, "You know she has been rehearsing that introduction for a week." I said, "She has not." Marta said, "She has. Halcott told me at coffee on Tuesday." She said Soline said your full name aloud to the mirror before the car came, just once, to be sure it would come out level. I said, "Halcott told you that." Marta said, "Halcott has been telling me small things for the last 3 months. She has decided we are on the same side now. I would not have chosen it. But I have accepted the assignment." I stared at her. She finished her drink and set the empty glass down on the tablecloth and said, "Go find her. She has been trying not to look for you, across a room for 11 weeks, and I would like to see the 2 of you not have to do that anymore." Then she walked away. I found Soline at the head of a small circle beside the 3rd window. She did not turn toward me. She did not need to. She adjusted the angle of her body by exactly 1 degree as I came into her peripheral vision, and the circle absorbed me without comment, and she introduced me to the head of the foundation as Ines Halloran, one of our core, whose recent work in the winter production has been extraordinary, and she said it in the same tone she would have used about any of the 4 dancers whose winter work had, in fact, been extraordinary. The head of the foundation shook my hand and asked me a polite and specific question about the choreography, and I answered it in a way that made her ask another. And Soline stood beside me with her drink and did not intervene. And for the next 11 minutes, I understood what it was going to feel like to be, professionally and personally, in the same room as this woman. For however many years we both stayed in this building, which was the thing I had wanted to feel since the intake dinner in year 1, and had not, until that 11th minute, allowed myself to name. In the 4th month, Vera Kirsanova cast me as the second lead in the spring gala. Soline had recused. It was Vera's choice, made independently, on merit, in a room Soline had not been in when it was made. When the cast list went up on the studio corkboard on a Monday morning at 9, Soline was in New York at a donors' dinner and did not see it until Tuesday. She sent me a text at 11 that evening from her hotel that said only, "Vera has excellent taste." I sent back, "She does." That was the only exchange we had about it. In the 6th month, I moved my books into her apartment. Not all of them, just the ones I read at night. The rest stayed at mine. I kept mine. We were not in a hurry. In the 8th month, Halcott brought me a coffee. Not to Soline's office. To the small break room off the studio corridor where the corps took their afternoon breaks. She set it down beside me on the counter and said, "You take it black," which was correct. And I said, "Thank you, Halcott." And she stayed for exactly one more moment before she left. And in that moment she said, "I want you to know that when she asked me to hold the 7:45 that Thursday, I did not ask her why. I want you to know I would not have asked her why on any Thursday, but I would like you to know I did not ask her why on that one." It was the closest thing to a personal statement I had ever received from Halcott in 5 years, and I received it with the appropriate gravity, which was to say I nodded once and drank the coffee and let her leave. That evening I told Soline about the coffee. Soline said, "Halcott has been running my life for 11 years and has never once, in that time, brought coffee to a dancer she was not delivering a schedule to. She has decided you are a permanent fixture," I said. "Is that all right with you?" Soline said. "It is more than all right. It is a relief. I have been waiting for Halcott to make the assessment. Because Halcott's assessments are load-bearing in this building and I would like this one to hold." In the year, we did not talk about the email. Not once. Not from December when it happened to the December that came after. The email had done what it needed to do, which was force everything that had been unnamed for 2 years into a room where it could be named, and having done that it had no further work to do, and we let it rest. I danced my first principal role in the fall of the following season. It was a revival of a piece that had been in the repertory before Soline took over, and Vera cast it after a formal audition in which Soline had taken no part. On opening night I stood in the wings in the second act costume, with the specific bright cold clarity of a first principal opening running under my skin, and I looked out through the flat and saw Soline in the 4th row of the orchestra section. Dark suit, hair up for the audience. She was not looking at me any longer, or more specifically than she was looking at the corps around me, and I understood that the discipline she was showing me from the 4th row was the same discipline she had shown me across 2 silent years, and that both versions of it had been, all along, the same act of love, only she had not been permitted to say so. I went out on my count. I danced the variation. I made a choice on the count of 32 that was not the choreography and was half a second better than what was written. I did not know I had done it until after. She had seen it. She always saw it. My mother was in the house that night. She had told me she was coming 3 weeks earlier over the phone, in the flat voice she used for decisions she had already made, and when I had asked why now, after so many seasons, she had said only that she had heard from my sister that there was someone worth meeting in New York, and she had decided it was time to see the stage the someone was watching from. She sat in the balcony because she said the orchestra rows made her nervous. She wore the good dress from her sister's second wedding. She cried in the 3rd variation, which was not mine, and Soline, who had understood without being told which woman in the balcony was my mother, sent a program to her seat at intermission with a note in graphite in the margin that said only, "She is why the count of 32 works. Yours, S." My mother kept the program. It is now folded inside the cabinet above the coffee maker, at the front of the stack, where the door still does not entirely close. In the small green room after the curtain, when the flowers had been delivered and the cast had scattered and the corridor was quiet, she came in and closed the door behind her. She did not say congratulations. She did not need to. She stood with her back to the door and looked at me across the small room, and she said, "Count 32. I said, "You saw." She said, "I always see." I said, "I know." She crossed the room. She put her hand at my jaw again, warm, present, the way she had put it the first morning in her office, and she said, "Thank you for the count." I said, "Thank you for the 4th row." She said, "I would sit in the 4th row every night for the rest of my life if you asked me to." I said, "I know." She said, "I did not ask you to say anything about that." I said, "I know that too." We stood in the small green room. Outside the door, the sound of the theater was going through its post-performance work, the ropes being reset, the crew calling in cues for the next night, someone laughing at the far end of the corridor. She did not kiss me. She held my jaw for 1 second longer, and then she stepped back. She said, "Dinner." I said, "Yes." We walked out together through the stage door into the night. I did not look at the letter she had signed on my behalf a year ago, folded away in her desk drawer in her office. I did not need to. She had signed it. She had filed it. She had accepted the review and made the modification and rearranged not just her calendar, but her whole architecture around the shape of what she loved, and she had done all of it before she knew whether I would ever walk through a green door on Aldercroft Street on a Wednesday afternoon in the fall. The corner of her mouth moved as we crossed the street. I had catalogued that corner for 4 seasons. I would catalog it for the rest of my life. It was the smallest and the most honest thing I had ever known, and it belonged, now, to a woman who was allowed to let me see it.